Welcome to Progress in San Diego, Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things. I'm your host, Walter Davis, and thank you for joining us. Today, we have the honor to have Mr. Dwain Deets. Mr. Dwain Deets is part of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And we're lucky to have Mr. Deets here in the San Diego County area. He's a former director of aerospace projects at NASA Dryden Flight Research Center. So, does that mean you're a rocket scientist?
Well, I dabbled in a little bit of the rocket part, mostly after they get back into the atmosphere, like the space shuttle, and need to land eventually.
So a pretty smart guy.
Well, I found out there was a lot to learn, and a lot that we really didn't know that much about. I learned more about it.
Can you explain that? What do you mean by that?
Well, when you get in the real world, which is what I was working in flight research, and we used to refer to that as where the rubber meets the road. So people can have all of their simulations and their fancy computers, but eventually you have to find out whether it works in the real world. Now that's usually in the atmosphere for a flight vehicle, but eventually it's got to be able to land and come back safely.
I see. So you're part of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Tell me about that. What is that?
Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth is a group founded by an architect, San Francisco Bay Area architect, Richard Gage, who is a member of the American Institute of Architects. The label is AIA that would go after his name. And he became aware of questions that were being asked about the World Trade Center, and possibly that it was not what the official story and the mainstream media has told us, but there actually were explosives planted in the building. This was about 3 years ago that he first heard about this, and he was so astounded. He heard about it as he was driving in his car. He had to pull over to the road and just digest what he had just heard. And then he basically said he's got to get some other of his colleagues, architects, to first of all see whether or not this is correct, and if so, then he thought it would be the thing to do is to call for a new investigation. So that was the start of it, and it's grown. Today there's 850 architects, or 835 architects and engineers that have signed this petition calling for a new investigation.
Now that's quite controversial, and it's really different than what the mainstream media is reporting. Of course, they're not really mentioning too much about the aspect of explosives being involved in the destruction of the Twin Towers, and there was also a third tower that went down, was it not?
There was. It was called Building 7, also referred to as WTC-7, a 47-story building that was about a football field length away from the nearest tower of Twin Towers, and it went down about 5:20 in the afternoon on that same day.
Now, having said that, Tower 7 is taller than any building here in San Diego.
It is. In fact, when I go out and look at some of the tall buildings here, I'm just astounded to think a building even taller than the tallest one in San Diego came down. We found out later in free fall speed for the first 2 seconds or so of the destruction.
What is the significance of the phrase free fall speed?
It actually shouldn't be called free fall speed. That is the common terms that are used by a lot of people. It should be called free fall acceleration, because it's an acceleration that is the very same as gravity would provide if there was nothing restricting the fall. So if you drop a brick, it drops at free fall acceleration until it hits the ground. And that was the case with Building 7. The top part of the building fell at free fall acceleration until it started to finally come across some debris and whatnot that slowed its descent from that point on.
Now that's pretty remarkable because these buildings had steel supports throughout. So what that means is that those steel supports were neutralized in some way. Is that correct? Or
Well, going back to the free fall acceleration case, Building 7, which is so clear cut, that's why we end up focusing on it. It means that suddenly, abruptly, the floors at the bottom, it turned out there was 8 floors based on the amount that it fell, had to suddenly be blasted away. Blasted is the only term you can use because it has to be out of the way so it does not restrict the fall at all.
Wow. And an aircraft didn't strike Tower 7, did it not?
I don't recall a third airplane hitting the World Trade Center. Interestingly, the World Trade Center was not even mentioned, not even one sentence, in the 9/11 Commission report. So not only did no airplane hit it, it didn't even show up in the report that was supposedly investigating the 9/11 happenings.
Hence, this is why you're asking for a new investigation.
That's right.
Now, I also understand that Tower 7 was on fire, but the fire was on the opposite side of where the debris struck the tower. Is that not correct?
There were small fires. At times they were on the side that the debris struck it. At other times they were on the other side. So it's hard to say exactly where they were. But this is a 7-hour period from the time that the tower fell that supposedly caused debris to start up fires for 7 hours before Building 7 fell. And there wasn't enough contents to be providing fuel for fires that long. And this is where basically the questions are being raised because the official explanation, which was done by one of the government agencies, its name is National Institute for Standards and Technology, and it goes by the abbreviation NIST or NIST. They were assigned the responsibility to investigate and report. And so their report said that it was due to fires, due to this debris striking from the collapse of Building 1, the nearest one. But their simulation models that they give some information on didn't even have the correct floors that correspond to where the photos that are available to the public shows that there are flames in the building. So the photos that the public has access to do not correlate with what the simulation results are in that report. That's one of many contradictions.
Now, to your knowledge, has any other skyscraper in American history collapsed in its own footprint due to a fire?
Well, there has been no steel frame structures, which skyscrapers are, that have collapsed due to fire. That's not just in America. That's worldwide. So this is the first occasion, if you want to believe the official story, that it happened, and it happened 3 times in the same day, which is a absolutely beyond belief coincidence.
So you're saying that Tower 1, Tower 2, and Tower 7 collapsed in their own footprint, and that's a unique occurrence, something that's never happened in the world due to a fire.
That's true. I will go back on Tower 1 and 2. It's not really correct to say that it came down its own footprint. It was blasted like 1,200, maybe 1,200 feet. There were huge girders, 40-ton girders that were blasted 600 feet away, and some of them impaled into the sides of buildings across the way. So that's not really in its own footprint. It did a heck of a lot of damage out there. Building 7 It was very precise. It did not do any damage to any surrounding buildings. Some were very close to it, so that was clearly in its own footprint. And just to follow up, it's never happened ever in the whole world history.
So what is unique about Tower 1 and 2 is that the debris field around the buildings was uniform. Is that not correct?
It was very symmetric. In all directions, it was the same distance of debris exploding out. And that very fact there, a symmetrical destruction. Yet the impact in both those buildings was from an airplane, so that's a asymmetric impact on one side. What you, basically the laws of physics say, if you have an impact by force on an object, then that force will cause it to move asymmetrically. In other words, there's no way for it to suddenly come down. If that is the cause, if it was because of the striking of the airplane. Of course, the official story is not, it was not the force of the airplane, they say, but it was the fact that fires due to the collision and the breakup of the airplane and the fuel then weakened the structure, the steel frame structure, and it came down. But even that would be an asymmetric thing, and it would not cause all of the steel across the whole width of either one of those buildings to all of a sudden get weak at the same time and come crashing down.
Now, jet fuel burns at 1,000 degrees, is that true?
Centigrade, essentially 1,000 degrees.
Okay, and the steel melts at 4,500, is it not, or what was it?
Well, the steel, they're saying it's softened, they being NIST. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to be a lower temperature than where steel melts. Mm-hmm. So the melting is considerably above where a fuel and office fire would cause it to melt. So this official explanation is saying, well, it wasn't really melting, it was just weakening, and that caused some structure to go. So it's I call it a hand-waving explanation of how this possibly could have happened. And there's a lot of other inconsistent data. In other words, if all you looked at was this part of the story and nothing else, then you could probably get into a little bit of argument one or the other. But there are other factors that are hugely cause this particular controversy to be totally insignificant. As an example, there is independent evidence from several sources that heats that were obtained within the structure, the two towers, were as much as 1,000 degrees centigrade higher than the temperature that NIST is saying occurred in the air. So that's 1,000 degrees of centigrade. That's almost 1,700 or so of Fahrenheit. It's a huge discrepancy. It's so large that the idea that fuel, airplane fuel, and office fires, it just absolutely makes no sense.
I see. Now, there are 835 architects and engineers in this organization, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and obviously you're very highly qualified. You're not just some run-of-the-mill type person. You have a great education. You have an excellent background in terms of dealing with aerodynamics and aerospace engineering. Yet you're having a difficult time, your group, obtaining a new investigation. Tell me about that. What's the resistance to conducting another investigation?
I think the resistance basically is people don't want to disturb the status quo. The worry about if this really is as bad as it seems like it's leading to, that maybe people were doing things that were unthinkable, that very information getting validated by the official people would be so damaging to our business as usual approach that just don't want to go there. I think that there's that attitude that, yeah, there might be something that went on, but it's better to just not dig into it and let's press ahead. I think there's that feeling, not only on the general public's side, but by professional engineers and architects. I very much find that people with that type of education still have the same reluctance as just general people that are just have nothing to do with this technical background. So it's not the fact that technical people are more either rational in their thinking. I think when you come to this big an issue, they are like other people, and many of them, very large number, just don't want to go there.
Now, some people have lost their jobs as a result of asking for this investigation. We recently had someone in President Bush's administration have to resign. Could you elaborate on that some?
He had, I think it was in 2004, signed a petition that was wanting to have some of these questions, particularly questions that were being asked by 9/11 family members that weren't being asked. And I think at the time he looked over the questions and they all seemed to be questions that someone should be asking and answering. And as far as I can tell, he signed that petition at that time. And now he was severely criticized for probably more than that petition said. In other words, the fact that he signed a question asking for some answers was presented to the public as if he was saying that it was an inside job by the government. That's not what it said, but that's the way it gets presented to the media, and the fact that it's not necessarily factual doesn't change anything. It presses ahead.
Now, there was another very troubling element involved in this, and that's the presence of thermite, correct? Can you talk about thermite and what that is?
Well, thermite, there's really two, let's say, cousins. There's thermite, which is more or less a standard high explosives or incendiary, depending on how it's used. And if it's an incendiary, it basically would make steel melt. But there is a much more advanced version, a military grade, that is called nanothermite, that was found to be in the dust at the World Trade Center. And it was obtained, there were 4 samples that were obtained of dust, one of which as recently as 10 minutes after the second tower came down. So there is no possibility that it was contaminated by cleanup crews. But there is a much more advanced version, a military grade, that is called nanothermite, that was found to be in the dust at the World Trade Center. And it was obtained, there were 4 samples that were obtained of dust, one of which as recently as 10 minutes after the second tower came down. So there is no possibility that it was contaminated by cleanup crews or anything like that. And that shows by science, an internationally peer-reviewed study team and publication, that this very advanced nanothermite, which is very much of an explosive, was present in very large quantities throughout both those 2 towers, and we don't really know whether it was in Building 7 or not, because the dust, we can't say for sure any of the dust came from Building 7.
Now, these explosives are used to demolish buildings, are they not?
Well, they're military-grade explosives to do things where you have a mission to have a very high explosives. So they can be designed, this nanothermite, it can actually be molded into different shapes. So it could be part of structures, It's got a lot of very interesting and unique characteristics. Another is that it can be sprayed on, and after it dries, then it becomes explosive. So it's possible that it was sprayed on the metal at some point in time. So there's a lot of things that could have happened. All that's been obtained by our 9/11 Truth researchers is that it was there, and it shouldn't have been there.
So it's highly indicative that perhaps the story that we are being told by the mass media is not correct. And we're going to have a part 2 to this show with Mr. Dwain Deets. There's so much information, and I'm very grateful that you chose to come on this show. We're going to talk a little bit more about false flag attacks. America's international policy has been shaped by the events of 9/11. America has developed a war machine from World War II that we've not been able to turn off. In fact, if the destruction of the towers is not a false flag attack, it'll be the exception as opposed to the rule. In the late 1800s, USS Maine was destroyed in Cuba, and the Cubans were blamed for destroying USS Maine, resulting in the Spanish-American War. Admiral Ricko's investigation of 1973 has proven that it was the ammunition and the fuel and the bulkheads of USS Maine that caused the explosion, not any type of Cuban sabotage. In World War I, Lusitania sailed from New York Harbor after being warned by the German Navy not to get underway. She had a naval escort which turned away and allowed German U-boats to sink Lusitania, thus causing America to enter World War I. In World War II, the Australian Navy reported a Japanese task force sailing toward Pearl Harbor. The United States government got the aircraft carriers on the way from the harbor, leaving the battleships, resulting in the deaths of more than 2,400 American sailors and soldiers. In the Gulf of Tonkin, USS Fletcher was supposedly coming under attack by North Vietnamese aircraft. Later, it's been proven that the commanders on station with that task force lied about the attack of North Vietnamese aircraft, thus giving America the excuse to enter the Vietnam War. Now we're embroiled in a battle in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and this entire foreign policy has been shaped by the events of September 11th. It also must be pointed out that there was military exercises occurring at that particular time. The NORAD aircraft that were tasked to protect New York were hundreds of miles away conducting an exercise, and in fact, the pilots didn't even know whether the attack that was underway was real world or an exercise. And you can hear their voices on the radio saying, "Is this real world?" Which explains the lack of response of U.S. combat aircraft in the events of 9/11. So, with the billions of dollars that we've spent on this war and the thousands of lives we've lost, the money that's been spent has been enough in just 1 month to ensure every American and to send every American senior in high school to 4 years in college. It's been a very expensive war, and I believe that it's warranted that we take a close look at the facts and details presented to us by the mainstream media. This is the reason that we have this show, Progress in San Diego. We attempt to give ordinary people a voice in our community to tell our stories, the positive stories, like the things you're doing, Mr. Deets. And I'm very thankful for the facts and details you've been able to bring forward. And I want to encourage everyone to look at the website that comes up at the end of this broadcast and the telephone number, and to get involved with the San Diego County Community Coalition. All of the people that we have here in the studio are volunteers. You're encouraged to get involved with our broadcasts and to come and become part of our crew. And you get to meet fine people like Mr. Deets here. And we're going to pursue some other aspect of your story in the second part of our interview. And I hope you'll come back and tune in with us on next week for the second part of this interview. There's just so much information that's germane to this topic that is simply impossible to get it all within one show. And I'm just very intrigued about the amount of research and the data that you've been able to gather, and information that you've been able to provide. And by the way, with the San Diego County Community Coalition, we do show a number of documentary movies that go over these facts and details that we've been talking about. So with that, we want to thank you so much for joining us and becoming part of this community effort. We're focused on bringing forth the truth. We're focused on becoming our own media. Far too often, we find that the current mass media structure doesn't bring us the truth. They don't tell our story. So here, on our public access shows, our efforts are geared towards bringing the truth forward and bringing forward good news. And in this effort, we're talking about citizens, and we're talking about scientists now that are dedicated to coming to the truth surrounding the events of September 11th. I want to thank you once again for joining us for Progress in San Diego. We hope that you'll come back and join us, and that you also consider becoming a member of our crew or coming in for the studio audience to watch us during our broadcasts. We have everyday people here doing extraordinary things. We're focused on peace, human rights, the environment, and social justice. And my encouragement is to have you join the San Diego County Community Coalition. Please see the website at the end of this broadcast. Welcome to Progress in San Diego, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. My name is Walter Davis, and I'm your host. We've been discussing the events surrounding September 11th, and today we have Mr. Dwain Deets of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And this is a part 2 of a show that we aired on last week. We talked last week about some of the discrepancies in terms of what the media has told us about the events of September 11th. The fact that Tower 7 fell without being struck by an aircraft. The fact that Towers 1 and 2 fell with essentially a uniform area of debris, and something that they say falling within their own footprint in terms of Tower 7. The fact that no building in the world has ever, no steel frame building in the world has ever fallen down within its own footprint due to an office fire. Also the fact that the effects on the metals within those structures required thousands of degrees higher temperatures than the degrees in which jet fuel burns. We talked about the fact that the NORAD aircraft that were supposed to be protecting New York were tasked hundreds of miles away from the city, and that the pilots were engaged in a military exercise and didn't know whether or not the events occurring were real world or part of the exercise. And in fact, the same thing happened in London. I believe they called their day their 7/7, if I'm not mistaken, where an explosion occurred within the subway of London, and it was deemed to be a terrorist act, even though an exercise was going on within the subway system in London. So there's several discrepancies. The presence of thermite, a substance that is used to make very high explosive military type destruction, was present within the towers with no explanation. So the architects and engineers of 9/11 Truth are simply asking for an investigation of the facts, yet there's resistance to that, and we're going to talk about why that is. Why do you think that there would be resistance to the government conducting an investigation and discrepancies in terms of what actually happened on that day when more than 3,000 American citizens lost their lives? So, Dwain, you are a very esteemed engineer. You have been the director of research and engineering at NASA. I mean, so you're not the everyday run-of-the-mill kind of guy when you're talking about the events that occurred here in 9/11, and as well as the other, 835 other architects and engineers that are part of the AE 9/11 Truth movement. Tell me some more about that. Tell the audience some more about the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Well, this group of architects and engineers, these are people that have been willing to sign a petition putting their name out there so that even though it may have a downside effect on their careers, those that are still working, they've gone ahead and felt it's important to have their name on the list to say, yes, there should be a new investigation. Now, it turns out these people come from all over the world. It's not just here in the United States. There's an interest in many countries, and a lot of people don't realize it, but there were more than just U.S. citizens that died in the World Trade Center. So like Japan had 22 of their Japanese citizens that died in the World Trade Center. So there are interests to find out exactly what the truth is, not only by some people within the United States. That AE 9/11 Truth is the acronym that goes with the full architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, but also in some of these other countries. It is a group that has a lot of different skills involved. Yeah, they're engineers or architects, but some of them are excellent in web design or web maintenance, and so they contribute in that way. Other people are contributing as a writer. That happens to be what I do for them. I'm heading up their writing team. So what do the writers do? They write the content that goes into the website, or we try to get it into publications wherever we can. And so we're always trying to find different ways of packaging the information so that it is more likely to be published in the more mainstream publication, the better as far as we're concerned. And there's graphics specialists. So people can be contributing to AE 9/11 Truth, even though they're not an architect or engineer. A lot of people, well, we've got physicists and we've got people that don't have any kind of technical degree, but they can contribute in these other ways. And so I'll just throw that out there in case people are looking for something that want to know how they can contribute. You can contribute with your skills. You can always provide funding, but that anyone can do that as well. So it's a group that is, I think, feels very strongly that this is an important mission and are very energized to do what they can to help. We think of it as a wake up the public, and because the public basically see what they see on mainstream media, and mainstream media is absolutely not covering this side or this viewpoint relative to the attacks on September 11th.
Now, we've talked about Tower 7 falling within its own footprint. We've talked about the debris field scattered around Towers 1 and 2, and the improbable way in which they collapsed with the jet aircraft and asymmetrical damage that occurred there as well. Mm-hmm. We haven't talked very much about the Pentagon. Has your group looked at the events surrounding the crash at the Pentagon?
Our group has not looked at that. One of the reasons is because the World Trade Center buildings are so clear-cut as far as we're concerned. It's solid evidence that all is very consistent with each other. The problem with the Pentagon is that any information is subject to national security. In other words, we can't get information out of the government relative to the Pentagon. We're just frustrated with that regard. We have enough frustrations on the World Trade Center where they cannot use, they, being the government, cannot use national security as a reason. I'll give you some examples where they do not even provide a reason why they don't provide responses for Freedom of Information request, FOIA FOIA is the acronym. A number of these have been submitted to the government, and what the government is supposed to do, the law requires them to respond with whatever information they have if a FOIA request comes in. Now, in the case of Building 7, up until November of 2008, which is just a little less than a year ago, they always used the answer for not providing information is that it was an ongoing investigation. But on November of 2008, they finally issued their final report. So they're not allowed to use that as their reason for not providing information. So now they just are not providing information. One example is they've got a very complex simulation of how the building collapsed. They will not provide any data about their simulation. In other words, no one can do an independent simulation with the same input data just to see if they did it correctly. We'd like to be able to do that. And this is going back and forth, and they said, well, it's going to cost you $820 or something to pay for the information. In other words, put it on a hard drive or something like that. We collected the money, we sent them a check, no response. So they are not responding to something they are legally required to do, and they've run out of reasons why not, so they just are stonewalling it.
And it must be noted that following the attack, alleged attack at the Pentagon, the United States government confiscated all the cameras of the surrounding hotels to capture the video so that it would not become available to the public. In addition, the parking lot at the Pentagon, the debris field was covered up by the CIA immediately after the crash. So there is very difficult to get information in terms of what actually struck the Pentagon. Now, I know a lot of the guests are probably wondering, why would our government want to cover up events surrounding the September 11th attacks? Can you elaborate on that more, sir?
Covering up from the standpoint of stonewalling it. And when we say our government, there's a lot of different avenues to our government. We have the administrative side, we have Congress, we have a judicial side. So I'll just give one example on the administrative side. Every department has what they call an inspector general. Inspector general is supposed to be independent. And there's a mechanism for people, citizens even, to make a claim if they feel there's been some wrongdoing. I actually did that. I filled out all the form within the Department of Commerce because NIST, the agency that was supposed to investigate Building 7, I basically was making a claim that they did not follow proper procedures, and I felt it was fairly good. I find that I can't even find out whether the Inspector General is processing this. They won't provide the information. They won't give me a number, a case number. All of that is something that they will not explain. So they are able to stonewall it. I think it's stonewalling. Maybe they're chugging away and are about to give an answer, but I certainly feel like they're not going to. And if you go over to the congressional side, there are various ways for members of Congress to not respond to citizens on this issue. They seem to be able to go so slow that basically nothing progresses. And there is one opportunity maybe coming up when there is a new director for NIST nominated by President Obama. That will have to go to the Senate for confirmation. And once it goes to the Senate, that is an opportunity, a very small window, where questions can be brought to your senators on that committee that would basically ask a question that would be putting this new director candidate kind of in the position that they would have to say something about the the errors that have been made in the, okay, say, falsifications of information. Now that individual has not been nominated, and I don't know whether there will ever be a nomination, because this is what a nomination would lead to, the opportunity to ask these kind of questions. So it could be that we'll go through the whole presidential term and there will not be a nominee for NIST.
That seems awfully peculiar, and I would imagine most Americans are not aware of those facts. Let's go back to some of the engineering facts surrounding the collapse of Towers 1 and 2. Now, it is my understanding that the floors were pulverized, so we saw this huge cloud of dust. I'm sure everybody saw the video footage of that traveling throughout New York and the streets, and people covered with it, etc. I also witnessed firemen, police officers, and office workers discussing that there were explosions and then the planes hit. Can you talk about that some?
First of all, there have been 118 first responders, which would be firemen and other varieties like that, who have given their oral testimony. These were very systematically taken shortly after the events. And then they were not released. And so they basically, there's stonewalling again. They were, the stated reason is for the protection of the families. They don't want to be bothering the 9/11 families with information like that may be disturbing to them. The New York Times filed one of these FOIAs, FOIA, to get that information released, and it actually was released. So we have all of these testimonies of 100 of these 118 firemen. Some of the testimonies refer to explosions and even before the plane struck. But there certainly were major explosions down in the main lobby and some of the sub-basements, all about the same time. So whether it was a little before or even if it was after the plane struck, there's no real explanation at all on how in the world something would go from the 81st floor or whatever the plane struck and cause a huge, massive explosion down in the lobby.
So there were reports of people having their backs broken in the basement of the building. There are people who had their faces crushed when the walls hit them in the basement of the structures. Firemen, again, police officers, first responders that have all reported that there were several major explosions before the plane hit and subsequently as the buildings were collapsing and coming down. So that's certainly just that one fact. In fact, it seems like there's several one facts. The fact that Tower 7 fell without being struck by an aircraft. The fact that the office workers and first responders reported small explosions prior to the plane hitting and prior to the building collapsing and as the building was collapsing. The presence of thermite, which is the military-grade explosive.
The nanothermite, or super thermite is another way to do it.
Okay.
But you want to always make sure that you make that distinction.
Okay.
Because if you just say thermite, let's take National Geographic Channel. They actually did an experiment to show that thermite wouldn't do that much damage. They blurred that difference between thermite, which is commercially available and doesn't really cause much of a bang, and the super thermite or nanothermite really means the same thing. That is very explosive and really only available through military channels.
Wow, this is quite eye-opening for me. Now we're down to the last 10 minutes, believe it or not, already on this interview. I want to make sure you get the points in to the public that you want to convey. I'm sure you want to let the public know how they can help. What are some of the things the public can do in order to support you in your efforts to get a new investigation?
Well, I will just say that the stonewalling will continue unless the members of Congress feel like their elections are in jeopardy if they are not supportive of a new investigation. And so anything that can make that become a concern to the representatives so that the next time that they are up for election, that they will know they will have to be supportive of it, is going to be the difference. And so there's a lot of ways that you can make your local representative or senator, either senator, feel the heat. There's all kinds of issues, important issues, health care, whatever. And so you kind of know what the methods are to raise the heat on your local representatives. This same kind of thing needs to be done for this issue. And I think it's only just now starting to happen. So I'd say any of the listeners, if you can help do that, and it might be just inviting a speaker. I'd be delighted to speak if, say, your local church or your political club, doesn't matter whether it's on the right or the left. This is still an important issue for the governance of our country, to be able to have truthful information that can be counted on, and that you know that the laws that pertain to it will be followed, or else there'll be consequences. We've got to get that communicated to the people that then will realize they're going to have to start responding to a need for a new investigation.
So we've got to hold our elected officials accountable.
Very definitely. I mean, how can we let them ignore some of these laws that actually pertain to the situation? I'll go back to the Building 7. NIST did not even investigate to see if there was explosives. Yet there is guideline on how they are supposed to investigate a building that comes down under these kind of circumstances. And it tells them what kind of tests they're to do to find out if there's explosives. What NIST said is there was never a question whether there was explosives. Or they said, later on when they were continually questioned, they said, well, they think that if they ran that particular test for explosives, it would not be conclusive. So they would rather save the money that would go into conducting those tests. I mean, those are just ridiculous answers for why they did not do the tests that are required of them.
Now, I understand that there was a countdown. The firemen were being pulled away from Tower 7, and there was a countdown, and people were saying the building is going to explode. And BBC reported that Tower 7 had collapsed 20 minutes before it fell. How can that be?
Psychic. BBC or their reporters know something that we don't know. I will say that only recently that full footage has suddenly become available. I hadn't seen the full footage, I'd just seen the piece where it happened, but you can kind of get a better perspective of how ridiculous this whole idea was, that you have reporters saying the building has collapsed, and there on the screen behind them the building is still standing. And as far as your countdown, one of the workers there, he was a former Air Force emergency response person. He reported of hearing someone standing by him that had it on their walkie-talkie that they pulled their hand over there, and it was the countdown, 3, 2, 1, and the building came down.
Well, Dwain, I really admire you for your efforts, and I hope that the public gets behind you. If you want to get in touch with Dwain, look at the telephone number and website that are going to be at the end of this broadcast. We as Americans have got to wake up. We've got to take our government to action for their lack of action or actions in this case. America's foreign policy has been crafted around the myth of the destruction of the Twin Towers by terrorism. May it be known that the Bush family has a long history of treasonous actions toward this country. George Bush's grandfather was responsible for providing the additives to the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, during World War II that they needed to attack America. In addition, their bank also provided funding to the Nazis and was shut down by law due to aiding the enemy. Now we have this story of 9/11 that everybody is focused on. The concrete industry, the people who manufacture bullets and explosives, the people that manufacture tanks. Think about how much fuel it takes to run our Navy ships out there constantly, day after day. And they've been out there since long before 2001. Just imagine how much money they're making. This country is spending over $500 billion on warfare annually. That's enough to insure all Americans. If we continue down this destructive road, where we continue to fund destruction as opposed to peace, where we continue to fund warfare instead of the welfare of our people in this country, we're going to continue to be destroyed. We see how our jobs are going overseas. We see how our government continues to invest billions of dollars. We see the debate now over universal health care. No one was concerned about how much money it was going to cost to launch this war machine to go to the Middle East. Yet there are all these questions about a balanced budget now. We talk about having universal health care for Americans. We talk about having schools for our children. We talk about having roads for us to drive our cars on safely. That's the kind of government I want. I want a government that's responsible to the people, a government that invests in education, not missiles and bombs and destruction around the world. The reason that some of these other countries can afford to have universal health care is because our Navy is out there. Our Army is out there protecting Europe. They don't have to send their ships and their soldiers out there. We're there. We're sending our sons and daughters. And if you don't get involved, your grandsons, your granddaughters are going to be sent out to fight battles and more false. We have incredible evidence that shows that the actions of our government during the 9/11 or the September 11th catastrophe is at best questionable. I invite you to join the San Diego County Community Coalition to get involved in our efforts for peace, to fight for human rights, and to fight for justice. We are people that are active in our community. Our shows are staffed by everyday people. You're welcome to join our crews or come in to become part of our studio audience. We also broadcast our events around the world on internet TV. So we do simulcast, so you can catch our shows at any time and go back and see the archives of these shows. I want to thank once again Mr. Dwain Deets for coming. We're going to have you come out again because you just got too much information for us. But we want to tell you just how very important it is for you to get involved. We welcome you to join us in our efforts to fight for our freedom and to stand up for the justice of people throughout this country. If we don't stand together, we're going to continue to be bamboozled and fooled and live in poverty and see our children die in unwarranted wars in distant lands. My name is Walter Davis, and thank you for watching Progress in San Diego. Join us again next week.
Could love drive you to fly? Could hope be the only way? And would it be a crazy question? Would you take it all and throw it all away? Take me down to the final decision, and the world will break apart today. Take me down to the final decision, and the world will break apart today. And the world will break apart today. Could freedom be between the lines? And joy a life foundation springing up to find that every thought will lead to nothing, no matter how hard you try to define. Take me down to the final decision, and the world will break apart today. Take me down to the final decision, and the world will break apart today. I open my arms to the end of time. I got one hand on a mummy and the other on a green tree, orange-eyed gecko. I got one foot on a street in the village and the other in a mine under Colorado sunshine. Under Colorado sunshine. Could you stand in the way of progress? Could you laugh it off and say, I'd let it all fall down and let the rhymes come. I'd waste away and let the roots grow around some. Take me down to the final decision, and the world will break apart today. Take me down to the final decision, and the world will break apart